Brian Hitting. I'm the chair here in the Environmental Studies Department at Gonzaga. Thanks for coming tonight. We've got a great talk. I want to orient you to another lecture. It's not until the spring, but I thought we should do some advanced advertising. We'll have in February a talk actually by Mike Peterson here from the Lands Council. We'll be doing a talk titled The Making of an Environmentalist, I think is what we're calling it, and it'll be about his own winding adventures in environmental activism. So look for that in the spring. But tonight we've got this talk, Coyotes and Knapweed, Urban Rewilding the Anthropocene, with Dr. Greg Gordon, who I'm very happy to introduce. So Dr. Gordon was born at the junction of Cherry Creek and the South Fork of the Platte River, a place also known as Denver, Colorado. He spent much of his adult life living along the Clark Fork and Dearborn Rivers of Montana, and now lives a short walk from the confluence of Lake Talk Creek and the Spokane River. Rivers have always informed much of his identity, relationship to place, and current research. The genesis of his first book, Green Goes in the Mist, was a canoe trip down the Yasuni River in Ecuador. His second book, Landscape of Desire, follows a group of college students on a 3-week trip along the Dirty Devil River in Utah. And his current project is a book about urban rivers and rewilding. His book that was a finalist for the Washington State Book Award was entitled...
Oh, I've forgotten now.
What's the title? It's your book. It was a very good book.
When Money Grew on Trees.
When Money Grew on Trees. Finalist for the Washington State Book Award, which is really impressive, though we can't remember.
I've purged it from my mind because it's
like the river studies, Dr. Gordon followed a rather circuitous route to his present position as an associate professor of environmental studies here at Gonzaga. After completing his BA in English from the University of Colorado, Dr. Gordon spent the next 5 years working as a seasonal park ranger in Utah, Alaska, and Washington. In 1989, he moved to Montana to attend graduate school and then spent the next 20 years leading field studies programs in Utah, Montana, Canada, Chile, Costa Rica. During this time, he also traveled extensively throughout South America, Asia, and Africa, but his home base was a yurt in the backwoods of central Montana, which I frequently use it as an example in class. If you want to live in a yurt to the woods, be like Dr. Gordon. In 2005, he returned to the university to earn his PhD in history and was then landed here at Gonzaga in 2011. We tenured him. We cannot get rid of him, and we're rather happy about it. So join me in welcoming Dr. Greg Gordon.
Thanks, Brian. Hey, could everybody just do me a favor and move down about 4 seats, and then I can put the microphone down, and I can address people. If we could fill up these first 4 rows, that'd be great. More intimate that way. I'm going to try it without the...
I'm not going to get any closer.
Yeah. So can everybody hear me without the mic, or should I be using this? I'm good?
Yeah,
or microphone? Good without it? Okay. What's that? Yeah, on this mic. It's like I'm wired. Okay, I will. And if at any time you need me to, my voice fades off, just raise your hand and I'll switch over to the microphone. It's just too many things for me to hold in my hand at once. So in many ways I see this more as a conversation than a lecture, and so I invite you all to sort of think about what I'm going to talk about and present some ideas and some feedback. None of the things I'm talking about are really established fact. I'm sort of stretching the boundaries a little bit and rethinking how we think about wilderness, wildness, nature in sort of our current era, which we're calling the Anthropocene. How many people, from the term Anthropocene makes total sense and you've heard of it? Okay, so some. Okay, let me start by saying that I'm kind of an old school wilderness guy. I spent much of my adult life traipsing around Alaska and Patagonia and Montana and Canada and southern Utah. And so what I'm about to say should no way be interpreted as diminishing big outdoor wilderness. I'm suggesting some other ideas, but we always need more wilderness. We can't do without the big Alaska, big Canada wilderness. But since I moved to Spokane, I spent a lot of time on short hikes around town, and a lot of that's due to just time constraints. And I began realizing there's a whole lot of things going on in our city, that there's tons of wildlife in our city. I frequently see more wildlife on an afternoon stroll through Spokane than I did on a recent week-long backpack trip in the Cascades. So I began scratching my head over that, and none of this is really astonishing, but it started to get me thinking about urban environments and what I like to call urban rewilding. So, for example, I live 3 miles away from campus. I live 8 blocks from downtown, and in my backyard, I've seen skunks, porcupines, turkeys, quail. I watched a Cooper's hawk chase a flicker from my bedroom window, and in my neighborhood, I've seen coyotes, deer, both bull and cow moose, and even a black bear, just in walking around Spokane. And I've come across bobcat scat, cougar scat, right out in the neighborhoods. You know, and just right out here, of course, we have Lake Arthur, which has turtles and herons and wood ducks and beavers in it. And so, you know, we kind of take that for granted to a certain extent. But what I'd like to suggest is maybe we should start thinking about our cities as wildlife habitat, not just places where people live and buildings are, but really be thinking about, can cities serve as refugia for wildlife? Can they actually serve for conservation purposes? I read a recent report that 8 out of 10 Americans now live in suburbs. More than half of the world's population is in cities. In the continental U.S., the total size of urban areas exceeds that of all of our national parks and wilderness areas combined. In other words, we have more areas that are cities, defined cities, than all of our national parks. And urbanization now threatens more species in the U.S. than any other human activity, primarily through habitat loss. A recent mapping showed that there's only 22% of the ice-free zones of the Earth are considered little to no sign of human activity. Everything else is cities, villages, agriculture, abandoned fields, or degraded lands. Nature is now essentially part of human ecosystems. And so not only does urbanization lead to a loss of biodiversity, but human residents of cities suffer from what people call nature deficit disorder, right? The loss of contact with the natural world. But increased exposure by urban dwellers to nature enhances our psychological well-being. These are established studies done over many years that show that just looking out of a hospital window to green space increases someone's recovery time versus looking at a blank wall. So we know that, you know, ecological literacy, connection with nature is good for us psychologically, physiologically. So the question that I want to raise is, can we increase biodiversity both for human well-being and for its own sake in an ever increasingly urbanized world? So unlike, you know, untrammeled wilderness, urban ecosystems are basically this merging combination of human and natural environments. And so this means we need to think on a lot of different scales. We need to plan and think about nature as something that provides maybe ecosystem services and function rather than the species composition. In other words, it sort of challenges us to think about what's the function of this ecosystem, what is it doing, rather than who's in it. And ultimately, it asks us to re-examine our notion of what constitutes wildness and wild nature. So I started wondering maybe that we have a real opportunity in our urban areas. You know, we've built the cities without wildlife in mind, but the animals are still here. We think of, oh, coyotes are invading our neighborhoods. Well, they didn't go anywhere. They're just here. In some cases, they are. In some cases, we're attracting wildlife, right? All of the plants we plant attract pollinators. There's much more biological plant diversity in Spokane now than there was 100 years ago or 200 years ago, right? You think about all the different plants that people plant, all the different flowers that are everywhere. And so, but they're all these species are adapting to our presence. You know, this light, right? How much light we have is changing the nocturnal patterns of animals. They're becoming used to having lights on throughout their activities. So I guess what I'm trying to explore is, can we rewild our cities to allow for human diversity and biological diversity to flourish? Rather than having these conflicts of having, like, we would call up the Fish and Wildlife because there's a moose in our backyard. I think there was, in 2017, there was 48 reports to the Fish and Wildlife Service in Spokane of moose removal incidences in the city limits. So they're here, right? And instead of thinking about it as conflict, maybe we can think about cities as natural habitat. So that's sort of the challenge I want to present for today. And this area is all full of concrete. You know, it's ugly. Homeless camp down here. It's got a lot of species in it. And sort of thinking more in terms, again, of functionality rather than aesthetics. Right? These aren't necessarily the most aesthetic areas, but can they serve function for animals? Do animals care how pretty it is? I guess is the question I'd ask. So I want to sort of quickly define Anthropocene here, and there's a little video I think that does a better explanation than I can do. And so
this is the story of how one species changed a planet. The latest chapter of our story begins in England 250 years ago. Fueled by coal, then oil, several brilliant inventions appeared. They ignited the Industrial Revolution, which spread like wildfire through Europe, North America, Japan, then elsewhere. The Great Redwood, then cars and highways, connected people across the globe. Medical discoveries saved millions of lives. New artificial fertilizers meant we could feed more people. Population rose rapidly. But this was nothing compared with what was to come. The 1950s marked the beginning of the Great Acceleration. Globalization, marketing, tourism, and huge investments helped fuel enormous growth. People swarmed to cities, which became even more powerful engines of creativity. In a single lifetime, the well-being of millions has improved beyond measure. Health, wealth, security, longevity, never have so many had so much. Yet 1 billion are malnourished. In a single lifetime, we have grown into a phenomenal global force. We move more sediment and rock annually than all natural processes, such as erosion and rivers. We manage 3/4 of all land outside the ice sheet. Greenhouse gas levels this high have not been seen for over 1 million years. Temperatures are increasing. We have made a hole in the ozone layer. We are losing biodiversity. Many of the world's deltas are sinking due to damming, mining, and other causes. Sea level is rising. Ocean acidification is a real threat. We are altering Earth's natural cycles. We have entered the Anthropocene, a new geological epoch dominated by humanity. This relentless pressure on our planet risks unprecedented destabilization. But our creativity, energy, and industry offer hope. We have shaped our past. We are shaping our present. We can shape our future. You and I are part of this story. We are the first generation to realize this new responsibility. As the population grows Welcome to the Anthropocene.
So if we accept that as a premise, what does that mean for urbanization? What does that mean for urban wildlife? What does that mean for how we think about the natural world? And what I'd like to suggest is I want to define, some more terms here briefly, and bear with me for a couple minutes here. Ecologists look at different stages of ecosystems, and this is sort of what we consider the wild, right? The historical natural state. And once things start to happen, you move outside the range of historical variability. In other words, we start modifying ecosystems, we start cutting down trees, we start, messing around with stuff, and ecosystems begin to change. But once they move outside, but all ecosystems are dynamic, right? Forest fires come, go, they change ecosystems. But one of the things we're exploring right now is we're realizing that maybe our forest fire cycles have exceeded out, they're now outside the range of historical variability. They've moved beyond to a new level. And therefore we move into what's called a hybrid ecosystem. It's this merging of human and natural systems that we've modified systems, we've sort of pulled some species out, we've added some species, we've sort of moved things around, and so we have these weird hybrid ecosystems that are no longer these natural or historical systems, but they could still be restored. And this is what ecological restoration is about, right? You take a system that's been degraded and you put a bunch of time and work into it and you can restore it back to its natural wild condition. This is ecological restoration. But in many cases, especially in cities and urban environments, right, we've put in pavement, we've crossed a threshold here. These systems can no longer be restored, right? Rivers are great examples, especially rivers in the West. Spokane River would be a good example of a system. It no longer has its dominant species, salmon, right? We've got 7 dams on it. We've modified the hydrology. We've changed the flow of it. We've changed the course of the river. We've channelized it. We've put in riprap. We've changed the species. It's full of carp and all sorts of other species that are exotic. We've modified it to the point where it crosses this threshold and it cannot be returned to this state. And ecologists call that a novel ecosystem. In other words, it's still functioning. It's a functional ecosystem. It sequesters carbon. It has nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. It has species. It has prey species, it has predator species. Pollination goes on. All the things that happen in ecosystems still continue to happen. It's just that this ecosystem is a product of human, it's an artificial thing. It's a product of human manipulation, but it doesn't require human manipulation for its continued viability. In other words, we've changed it, but we've sort of walked away. Unlike an agricultural field or Manitou Park. Manitou Park would be a designer ecosystem, right? We have constant inputs. We're fertilizing it. We're cutting down things. We're constantly manipulating it. It can't function without humans. But novel ecosystems can. They function without us, even though they're a product of our disturbance. So I'm going to sort of define those terms. And when I started looking at those terms, I started thinking about, you know what, there's really no place on Earth that hasn't been touched by human activity. And what does that mean for wildness? This idea that systems can be self-sustaining and that they have this intrinsic sort of character to them, that they shape their own destiny, if you will. Can these novel systems actually be wild systems, even though ecologically they're no longer in this state? So that was sort of the thing that I've kind of been toying with and exploring. Some key characteristics of novel ecosystems, right? So these are new species combinations, right? We've taken the salmon out, we've added carp. Human agency, right? We've manipulated, we've degraded the systems, we've put in dams on the river, we've changed things around, abiotic environment, massive changes, and it cannot be returned to historical condition, right? Unless we go down and take down every single dam on the Spokane River. We let the floodplain go back and forth to where it was. At one point, the floodplain came right up to where this building is. The river would have moved over here. So are we going to do that? Probably not. But the key point is it's self-sustaining. It doesn't require human intervention anymore. Assumptions that we make about native ecosystems, on the other hand, is we say they're better at performing ecosystem services, they're more biodiverse, more resilient, more desirable, and more wild. But a number of ecologists are actually looking at this and saying, you know what, some of these, this doesn't necessarily hold true. A lot of hybrid or novel ecosystems, this is a novel ecosystem. This is down at Bowl and Pitcher. The novel ecosystems can perform ecosystem services. They can sequester carbon. They can house pollinators, often more than native ecosystems. They're often more they also have more biodiversity. It's not native biodiversity, but in terms of sheer numbers of plants and animals, it can be increased. Sometimes they're more resilient, right? They have adapted to human interaction. They've adapted to a real changing world, a world that is modified and is a product of human manipulation, and these systems are doing quite well under those circumstances. But, you know, these are human values. Are they more desirable? I mean, is it sort of our own prejudice, if you will, that assumes that a native system is better than a novel ecosystem? So, you know, looking at other cities that are exploring these concepts, and most of this is occurring along rivers, right? Because rivers are sort of one of the last remaining places in cities where there is some sort of self-sustaining ecosystem. Again, they're good examples of novel ecosystems. This isn't a novel ecosystem. This is a concrete viaduct, right? There's no ecosystem going on there. But the Los Angeles River is an interesting example because this is the Los Angeles River. Water still flows through it. And in Los Angeles, they've engaged in one of the largest, I don't want to call it ecological restoration because they recognize they're not restoring it back to its original condition. That's gone. But they're revitalizing it. And I prefer the term renaturalizing. And you'll see why in a minute. So this is what I think it's a $1.6 billion plan, basically, to take what you saw and turn it into this. It's been passed. The Army Corps of Engineers is working on this. And the idea is to basically turn it into green space. And is this a natural ecosystem? No, right? It's a human-created park. It's a designer system. It's got some nature to it. So that's sort of why I look at that as on one end of the scale of renaturalizing an ecosystem. But what I'm interested in is this concept of rewilding, right? So we have renaturalized systems like the LA River, right? They have infrastructure. They're really expensive. It increases biodiversity, very aesthetic, right? We want it to look nice. We want it to be pastoral and have water running through it, and et cetera. It often leads to gentrification, sort of a side note to a lot of these revitalization projects. But they can provide opportunities for environmental education, and it improves human well-being, right? It's access to nature, access to open space. And so there's certainly some benefits to a renaturalizing approach. But thinking about rewilding with novel ecosystems, the priorities change a little bit. That what we're looking at is biodiversity and ecological processes. This is probably more important than aesthetics. Can we start thinking about how we can actually use these systems to help us understand ecological changes going on and environmental changes. As well, they provide ecosystem services and, increased human well-being, but systems that are, that have their intrinsic wildness, that aren't being manipulated and manicured, etc., could these systems as well serve some of these purposes if we sort of basically let them go wild? So, like I said, I spent a little bit of time looking around at some areas, and one of the places I looked at was San Antonio. I pretty much looked at Western rivers because I'm really interested in how we as Westerners conceive of ourselves in relationship to nature. And it seems like in the Western U.S., that we tend to have this affinity toward the natural world and think of ourselves as being in nature, and that our cities in many ways are new and they're in the process of reinventing themselves. We Westerners have kind of been, people move to the West to reinvent themselves, cities are new, and so maybe there's some opportunity here. But San Antonio is an old city, one of the oldest in the country, settled by the Spanish missionaries. The first dam in the United States is in San Antonio, I think built in 1650, aqueduct, Spanish aqueduct. It's still there, but it's pretty cool to look at because it's completely overgrown. It's been rewilded. But this is sort of the famous San Antonio Riverwalk. What San Antonio did in response to flooding is they built this, I don't know, it's a canal, right? It's a canal and a bunch of water and a tourist attraction. It's not an ecosystem. It's not even close to the LA River in terms of renaturalizing. It's just a place you can go to look at water while you're having your cocktails. But if you go about 3 miles from downtown San Antonio, you come to this. I don't know if you can see this. This is the Lone Star Brewery. See the Lone right there? This is in the middle of the industrial area of San Antonio. The interstate highway goes right by, well, 3 interstate highways cross right over here. This is an industrial zone. This is where all the heavy industry is, and this is the same San Antonio River coming through there. Well, swimming's not encouraged. A lot of bacteria, but you know what? The great herons, or great egret rather, great egrets don't care. There's fish in there. This is a completely constructed artificial thing here. This is what they do. They use these as kayak runs. They try to promote tourism and people getting on little kayaks and zipping down these things from one pool to another. People can come down here by these concrete steps. This is obviously completely artificial, but you look at all the vegetation in here. These are considered birding hotspots. Some of the best bird activity in central Texas is right along the San Antonio River in the middle of this industrial area. Again, the great egrets, you can look at this constructed ecosystem here. It's making use of it. Right? Ospreys don't care if that's a telephone wire. It's a place to perch. And so we start thinking about cities as providing habitat infrastructure that animals and wildlife can actually use regardless of how natural it is. It kind of makes us possibly open up some questions. This is a butterfly garden, right? A lot of native and non-native species trying to promote native butterflies, pollinators, etc. This is manicured, human-created systems. The cool thing about researching rivers is you get to spend a lot of time fishing. And you get to meet people who like to fish. And fly fishing on urban rivers is sort of, I don't know if it's a cottage industry, but maybe I'll make it one. So, this is a nice aesthetic picture of a fly fisherman in Colorado, right? I mean, you could be on an alpine lake somewhere, or a river up in the mountains in the Rockies. So, My friend John here is standing in the middle. He works with Trout Unlimited, and I met him in Denver. And this is at the confluence of Cherry Creek and the South Platte River. This is Mile High Stadium is right back there. This is Elitch Gardens. After we spent half a day in here fishing, we tromped on our waders up to Soho and went and sat down at my brother's bar, I think was the name of it. And we're standing there, our waders, and people are coming up to us. Were you guys fishing? We're like, yeah. He's like, what are you catching? Trout. And people, their minds are just springing because they don't think of this as a trout stream. There's trout in there. So, you know, fishermen care more about what's in the river, like the animals. They care more about, you know, is this a functional system rather than is this the most aesthetic place to be standing. We talk about gentrification. This all is coming down. High-rise condos, high-end condos are going to go in here. They're going to redesign this creek. A lot of the South Platte is what I call the engineered ecosystem, looking like this, right? There's about 40 CFS coming through the South Platte here. That's kind of an average summer flow, really, really low water. They don't get the kind of water we do in the Spokane River. So what they've done is they've channelized and constructed this to make it look natural. This is Confluence Park, one of the most popular places in downtown Denver. People come, hang out, have lunch. It's also right below the headquarters, the big REI in Denver. So thinking about how we think about recreation, how we think about nature, how we think about wildness, if we could have REI located right here and this manufactured, artificial, created ecosystem, what does that sort of mean about our relationship to the wild? Are we losing it? Is the Anthropocene a time when if we're going to put REI and Starbucks here and call this nature, have we sort of lost our connection to what we call the wild? Does it matter? The Brewers' blackbirds don't seem to care, right? There's human food, and these are native species making use of human creations. It works for them. So these are all kind of head-scratching things that I've sort of been struggling with. I think one of the systems that stands in a little bit of contrast, and I know Ryan might dispute this, is the Boise River. The Boise River is probably the best example I've come across in where they've done a lot of ecological restoration. Unlike the South Platte and Denver, that they've had to channelize because of flooding, Boise's response to flooding was to recede from the shoreline, right? Pull back from the floodplain, let the river do its thing. Here's Trout Unlimited planting willows along the riverbank here to help restore the, help prevent flood or sedimentation from coming in here. It's amazing how fishermen are really concerned about both what's in the aquatic ecosystems as well as the riparian zones. This little slough in Boise is about a 5-minute walk from the downtown. But Boise is becoming kind of an outdoor mecca. And again, sort of getting back to that REI question is our desire for a play culture, our desire for adrenaline-driven sports supersedes our values that speak to ecological restoration. So this is highly sought after, very popular diversion dam that was converted into a playway for surfers right outside of downtown Boise. Again, a very popular place, completely non-natural, but again, it's sort of begging the question of does our recreational needs, are they no longer dependent upon the natural world? Can we create sort of our outdoor recreation in non-natural, non-wild environments? Gentrification, this is right outside that play wave, what it looks like right now, what it'll look like tomorrow. So, you know, are we in this process of enhancing ecosystems? Are we redesigning our unintentionally neighborhoods? Are we losing neighborhood diversity? Are we losing human diversity and biological diversity at the same time? Right outside here, you know, kind of bringing it home, is Lake Arthur. You guys are probably all familiar with Lake Arthur. And I see Lake Arthur is sort of a good example of a novel ecosystem because it didn't ever exist before humans, before modern humans, before industrial America. This is the Spokane River in 1941. This is what kind of Lake Arthur. It was a log pond for the McGoldrick lumber mill right here, which is where the law school is today. So they'd bring logs in on this train. You guys have probably walked on this causeway on the other side of Lake Arthur, between Lake Arthur and the river. There used to be a railroad track. Bring the logs down, dump them in here, and they'd sit there until they were getting ready to be sucked up into the lumber mill. Of course, and here's Gonzaga's infamous football stadium, undefeated since 1941. 1960s, students began to go down here and clean it up. The lumber mill burned down in 45, and different groups of students in the 60s organized cleanups, went down and kept cleaning it up, and eventually Father Arthur Dussault pushed for the creation of a pond, and this is 1967, no, 1973. You can still doesn't look too much different outside the Lake Arthur today. The creation of a pond, and in the 21st century, a lot of our environmental students have taken upon themselves to sort of look at this and say, well, let's revitalize it. Let's engage in ecological enhancement. Again, we're not restoring it because we don't want to put it back to a log pond. We want to make it something new and different and increase its ecological value, increase its biodiversity, increase its value for human and wildlife interactions, increase its wildness. And so this is their conceptual master plan, put in floating islands in the lake here, a little path around the shore, maybe kind of drop the shoreline a little bit, you know, more riparian vegetation with potential of a swale here to sort of catch the runoff from the soccer field, which was increasing the nitrogen levels. And in 2017, Earth Day, 35 students got together and they applied for a grant from the Green Fund and purchased these floating islands, planted them with all sorts of native plants. These are sort of burlap, basically these are burlap bags that are sitting on plastic floats. And if you go out to Lake Arthur, you can see those. They're sitting out there. This is their third year, and they seem to be working. The turtles come out and sit on them. No breeding turtles have been observed on there yet, but they're using it. The plants have come back every year, so we're starting to see these things actually have some function and move into the ecosystem. And so what I suggest is that, you know, if we think about this the right way, if we think about it in terms of how we can enhance wildlife and human diversity, that we really have an incredible opportunity here. Again, you know, Spokane, we have Mount Spokane State Park, we've got Mica Peak, the Dishman Hills area, and here we're starting to connect all these places with ecological corridors. Can we really start to move into thinking about urban areas as wildlife, not just wildlife friendly, but actual wildlife habitat and actually wild places? Is there a way to sort of rewild our urban systems? So that's sort of what I've, you know, throwing that all out there. Kind of a lot of those are questions. I don't really necessarily have answers to them. Sort of things I've been thinking about and exploring, and I certainly invite anybody's questions, thoughts, input etc., that you may have.
And so we're recording, and so to make sure the volume is loud enough, I'm going to run around to the mic if anybody has a question. But let's thank Dr. Gordon for his talk. The most fun part, Q&A. Anybody have a question? We'll start with students for sure first. If any students have a question, you can try and filibuster for the next 45 seconds if you want.
I'm Miles. So, like, what happened with the gentrification in San Antonio? Or was it San Antonio?
Oh, so that's a good question. So gentrification has happened every place that these kind of amenity-driven revitalization projects. So we're seeing it start to happen in LA. It certainly happened in San Antonio. It's starting to happen in Boise. You can look at Kendall Yards right up here. You know, it's sort of the west central neighborhood becoming a little more gentrified with the, you know, the bike path through there. It overlooks the river. As we begin to look toward natural amenities to enhance our well-being, there's the downside of that is it can lead to gentrification. I don't have a good answer for how to avoid that, but I think it should be something that is part of the conversation. And I think what I'd like to suggest is having systems that embrace wildness or self-sufficient ecosystems tend to be less gentrified than ones that are manicured ecosystems. So that if, for example, if you had a river running through a city and it looked something like this, it has less property value. Well, Boise is probably not the best example, but than this, because this tends to be when they do something like this, it tends to be in a neighborhood that looks like that. And so I think the rewilding concept has potential to address both issues. You know, if we're not just always putting bike paths and green lawns everywhere, then maybe we can also sort of offset the gentrification.
Thank you.
I guess my question is, do you think there would be any chance for a novel ecosystem to disrupt a local historical ecosystem?
What are you thinking? You get an example, or?
Yeah, like say, because we have a good amount of protected regions within 5–10 minutes of downtown Spokane that have a relatively historical ecosystem or something not similar to what we have downtown. Could, say, an area that maybe still sees, Spokane's a bad example, but maybe an area that still sees salmon be disrupted by an area that has adapted to now have carp in it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I think, you know, my research on novel ecosystems, the novel ecosystem concept is pretty new, and most of it's coming out of Puerto Rico and Hawaii, on islands. But a lot of people, they're just now starting to apply it to rivers. I don't think, I think it's possible, right? You could possibly have a novel ecosystem that had exotic species that were there and had become a functional part of that ecosystem. And your example of carp might be a good one, where maybe in Long Lake, Lake Spokane, in that ecosystem, they're part of the ecosystem. But if, say, downstream or another part of the ecosystem, people begin to restore salmon runs, then it's possible they could disrupt that. Yeah, yeah, that's certainly an interesting thought and observation. Yeah.
restoration, or I guess that, as as environmentalists, we're kind of pushed to this understanding of we want to get nature back to its historical stance. Is this still productive, or is this even still a possibility, do you think, inside the Anthropocene?
I think that's exactly the point that I want to challenge, is that in the Anthropocene, that it's perhaps we need to rethink when we talk about restoration. Like, what are we restoring it to? Are those historical conditions, are they no longer even viable? Have we changed the ecosystem, the climate, et cetera, so much that we're trying to restore something back to a condition that it's not really the best suited for the contemporary era? Now, that opens up a can of worms, right? Because then all of a sudden you're like, oh, well, then we could do anything. But I think ecologically we want to make sure that we're talking about the functionality, and we're talking about an ecosystem that is in fact outside of its historic range. A good counterexample would be the White Salmon River. Or is that the one they took out the Condit dams on? Where's the Condit Dam? The Elwha is a better example, right? The two dams on the Elwha, all of a sudden salmon are going back up, right? So you did one little thing, but that was in Olympic National Park. So you had a really viable habitat. You had a lot of everything was sort of intact except for these two dams. Whereas the Spokane River, it's, again, unless we're starting to take out all the dams, we're talking about we got to get rid of all the exotic fish. Maybe that it's better to push it to a resilient system and think systematically rather than think about prioritize individual species and a particular historical state that may not actually even be possible anymore. Another example would be Cedar Groves, right? It's going to be really hard for us to restore any cedar groves in eastern Washington because of climate. They're just not going to grow back as cedar groves once they're gone. So
would then it be, as environmentalists, kind of taboo, but would it then be appropriate to replace those cedar groves with maybe a non-native tree that would replace the cedar grove insofar as function within that ecosystem?
Well, that's the idea of assisted migration, right? Is to take species and help them move to new habitats, right? And so, yeah, it is sort of a taboo subject, especially from an environmentalist perspective of the value is in the native ecosystem. We sort of prioritize that. And so what I'm questioning is in an already disturbed ecosystem like a city, do we do that? Do we need to really worry about that in cities so much as recreate or offer cities the opportunity to sort of create completely new things, new ecosystems? So that's why I sort of preface at the beginning by saying, I'm not talking about wilderness areas the places that are wild and national parks by any means. It's focusing on areas that have basically been either totally degraded or are completely not what we're not even looking at historical, baseline. We're so far from that. But does that mean that we can't have ecological value in those systems? In other words, taking those ugly scenes and saying, well, that has some really ecological value. And maybe it has some real human value. And maybe there's a lot of things we can do with those systems, allow them to be, and I'm sort of extending that to maybe we can allow them to be wild. Maybe nature knows best. Maybe the resiliency of species can flourish and evolve.
Greg, one question I had, moderator's discretion here, since I so I'm curious how you're using, I don't think I had heard you define wilderness. So in the Anthropocene, does the concept make any sense? If there, as you said, there's no place that hasn't been touched by human activity, depending on what we mean by the term, is the term wilderness no longer applicable in the Anthropocene? Or another way of looking at it is we've got sort of at least three different models. One would be a binary conception, either this is wilderness or it's not. Another would be a threshold concept where it has to cross a threshold to be considered wild, or just a simple degrees. Third view would be something can be more or less wild, but there would still be a threshold, I assume, past which it would no longer be wilderness. And in the Anthropocene, are we just simply at a point where the concept is now meaningless?
No. No. So, looking at the ecologists look at all the world terrestrial biomes, and they look at that as a whole, say, at 22% of the planet is basically a human system. These are, either it's been so heavily modified by pavement, cities, villages, agriculture, etc., that it's outside of any natural system. But the concept of wilderness, I think we still have those 20%, 1/5 of the terrestrial planet is still can still be considered a functional wildland, right? So places like wilderness areas and national parks and the deep rainforest, Alaska. I mean, there's a lot of land out there that still functions with its own self-sufficiency, even though we've modified the climate and it's having to respond to those climatic changes. I think, I don't want to toss out everything and say, well, it's all novel ecosystems. There's a handful of ecologists that would say that, but just like tiny, they'll get there. But I'm talking about like anthropocentric systems or anthropogenic systems.
I have a couple of questions, Greg, but I'll ask them one at a time. First is, were you able to discover what kind of financial resources led to the developments that you did see? So like say in Boise, was the same money used to create a more natural looking state, the little slough area with lots of trees and color that created the wave line? And was that really out of the kind of city development? So is it, I'm thinking it's a little more driven around city development and business development and income development in an area that's interested in tourism or higher resident prices, and so the whole scheme is really around satisfying a buying customer, right? And that's a little different than trying to protect human diversity and thinking about the risks and the real losses to human quality of life by reducing diversity of families and income levels and so on in the same neighborhood. So did you learn anything about those elements behind these other systems?
So that's a great question, thanks. Went back to this slide because this whole scene here has been driven by this developer. So guy that bought Elitch Gardens a few years ago, basically he's going to tear down the amusement park, put in high-rise condos, and as part of that redevelopment, he's going to put he's the one who put all the trout back in the river. He dumped, with the Trout Unlimited and Fish and Wildlife approval, he's the one who's putting all the fish in here to restore the native fishery because he wants to sell these condos to people who want to go fly fishing out their front door. So in this case, it's driven by private development and a lot of money. Some of it is driven by flooding. Like, what's the proper response to flooding? Floods are incredibly expensive. So Denver's response was, let's channelize the South Platte. We'll put 3 dams on the tributaries that flow into the South Platte. We'll basically block off all water, and we'll just make this concrete thing, get the water out of here. And that was their response in the 1950s. And they've spent the last 50 years trying to figure out how to make it a more attractive place to be, how to clean it up. Whereas in Boise, their response was after a number of floods was, you know what, because the entire valley is a floodplain, unlike Spokane, right, where we've got this river and then we're outside of it. You know, it's much easier to put some, you know, let the river kind of go where it wanted to go and just not have the development in the floodplain. And I'm not sure how intentional it was, but it turned into, over the years, a major tourist mecca. And I think a lot of places are looking at something like this and saying, can we do this? And all of these rivers I looked at, floating the river, like tubing in the Boise River, kayaking, you know, down the South Platte, kayaking down the San Antonio River. All the river authority government agencies are kind of pushing recreation as a way of funding these projects. But the problem is that the recreation has certain perspectives or needs that aren't necessarily the ecological needs. So I think the short answer is the ecology always comes at the bottom, but you know, maybe there's ways of sort of integrating ecosystem services so that we can actually have more of a wild functioning system. I talked to an engineer that was working on this project, and he said, you know, we found out if we stopped cementing these boulders, they started to move around in the river, and then we didn't have to go back every year and re-cement them. And it saved us a lot of money by just leaving it alone. So maybe with that, we'll...
Maybe, do we have one more? We have time for maybe one more, if there is one more.
I knew Mike was going to have...
I don't need a mic.
You are Mike. You are Mike.
He wasn't going to let me get away with this.
Spokane has a pretty native ponderosa pine forest. It's also got a lot of non-native riparian, you know, grasses that are not, that we're keeping out. It's got knapweed. In my alley, it's got knapweed in West Central, which keeps out other plants. So it seems like we're a hybrid, novel mix here. So how do we reach out to these communities and actually get them to embrace these ideas and move forward on creating this vision?
Well, I don't know. That's a really good question, because it's easy to say we want to restore native ecosystems. It's sort of that's a nice package sell, right? And it resonates. So I think when you start getting into the nuances and the complexities, it becomes much more difficult to address those things. And I think my understanding is we're doing it, but we're not using this terminology, which seems fine. You know, that we talk about the need for conservation. We talk about the need for habitat, right? Can we have increased habitat along our river riparian zones? I think a lot of it is trying to it seems like some of the biggest issues are more with city and county conservation districts that don't want to ever admit that there could be a non-native species that has value. And I think that becomes a challenge. But I think if we push for the conservation of the land itself, that nature will kind of sort it out if we don't push too hard and try to pick winners and losers, if that makes any sense. I don't know, is that... I don't think the nuances of not talking about novel ecosystems are going to be a very good PR avenue. I don't know, what do you think? It seems like it's a tough...
And maybe it's our changing climate is going to drive people looking for alternatives to their lawns that might have a lot more natural habitat for a lot of critters.
Right,
But
right.
not necessarily native, but
I was going to say, you don't necessarily just go to native. You say, what's going to survive, you know, in a
Right.
In a 2 Celsius.
Right.
plants.
Right. we accept dandelions and mullein, but not knapweed. Right? But you know, years ago, dandelions and mullein were considered, you know, evil. You know, so it may be approaching like let's let it go natural, and I think that term still is kind of a more resonant one.
Good place to stop. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks a lot.